Have you been victimized by one of the most abusive practices in all of statindom? If you've been told that you're experiencing the nocebo effect or that your adverse effects are all in your head, then you may very well have been. Today I'm going to talk about the misuse of clinical trial results to make claims that go far beyond what the data supports. Stay tuned. In my previous video, I rolled out this taxonomy on different types of statin intolerance. First, there's physical intolerance, which is adverse effects, also known as statin toxicity. Well, let's call it what it really is. It's actually statin poisoning. There's psychological intolerance, and then there's philosophical intolerance. Today, I'm going to be talking about the psychological intolerance. Under psychological intolerance, there's anxiety that can be caused by the thought of or the act of taking statins. I'm not talking about anxiety as an adverse effect, which is also something that can exist. I'm talking about just the anxiety that you have from thinking about this scene. I'm taking this pill that's going to mess with my liver. Not going to talk about that today because I really want to get into the next thing, the nocebo effect. Yeah, it's real, we have to admit that, but how big is it really? So I'm going to be talking about the Samson Trial. This was first reported in 2020 in the New England Journal of Medicine. It purported to show 90% of the adverse effect load from statins was also elicited by placebos. And the key word there is load, and as we go along, we'll see what I mean by that. But did it really show that? That's another thing I'm going to look into. But when that first came out, there was a headline in MedPage Today, Samson Trial, 90% of statin complaints are nocebo effect. But the study authors actually didn't claim that. Even though these two statements superficially look the same, they are not. And I also question the 90% value, but that's beside the point right now. These are not the same statement, and the writer of this article's headline at least should have known better. Here are some of the details of the study. First, it was a small study with only 60 patients who had previously stopped statins because of their adverse effects. So with a study that small, we're not going to be able to reach the statistical significance that can apply to larger populations. The patients were given 12 bottles, totally randomized. 4 of them contained placebos that were indistinguishable from the 4 that contained statin, and the statin was a 20 milligram dose of Lipitor each day. And then there were 4 empty bottles with no treatment in them. And you may ask, well, why would they give them empty bottles? Well, these bottles were either marked 1 to 12 or maybe by month, and that way the patient wouldn't get confused about, well, what am I supposed to be doing this month? I can't find the bottle. Well, no, I found the bottle, and it's empty, so that means, oh, I'm not supposed to be taking it this month. It was blinded for whether the patient was taking a placebo or a statin, but it was obviously not blinded for whether they were taking no treatment because they would look at the bottle and it would be empty and they would know, oh, I have an empty bottle. I'm not taking anything this month. Patients rated and reported their symptoms daily by way of a phone app, and that included the months that they weren't taking anything because they wanted to establish a baseline for how much of these subjective pains or aches does the patient just have in their normal life through everyday living. As with any clinical trial, there are limitations, and a good trial designer will acknowledge those limitations up front. For this one, people with independently measurable adverse effects from their statin use were excluded. Now that's my wording. I just looked through the list of the enumerated things that would exclude somebody from the trial. Rhabdomyolysis was excluded from the trial. You don't want to subject somebody to actually getting that again if they've managed to recover from it. Necrotizing myositis, another example. Elevated liver enzymes is another thing that excluded somebody from the study. Only quick presentation adverse effects were being studied here. In other words, those adverse effects that showed up within 2 weeks of the onset of taking the statins in the person's history. Problem there is, of course, a lot of statin adverse effects take a long time to show up, and they acknowledge that these weren't included in this study. So what wasn't spelled out is the result of this, and that is the target population for this study is more likely to exhibit the nocebo effect than the general patient population. There are some unspoken assumptions also. First one was adverse effects, if they were truly statin-induced, would resolve quickly when the patient went on placebo or into a no-treatment month. Secondly, withdrawal effects were totally ignored, that during the non-statin months, they just don't exist. I don't think withdrawal effects are on anybody's radar. I don't think that the medical profession even understands that there can be such a thing. I experienced it. If you've seen any of my past videos, that's how I figured out what the statins were doing to me. Probably happening to a lot of people who just don't recognize it. There's also a common misconception here, and that is that the effects felt on statins are not real if they're also experienced on a placebo. It's possible that a person has a nocebo effect, but also really does feel these things while they're on statins. It's like a hypochondriac can really get sick on occasion. I'm not calling people who experience the nocebo effect hypochondriacs, but you see the analogy. Now, there are some expectations and rules that they were following. Patients' baseline symptom levels would not be counted against either placebo or statin, and I'll show how that works in a moment. Placebo-based symptoms are either the same or higher than when on the baseline. Makes sense. Also, the statin-based symptoms would be either the same or higher than the placebo. I mean, these are just kind of the way in their minds this should be working. There is an assumption that the real statin adverse effects are only the excess over the placebo adverse effects. And I don't think it works like that. I mean, think about this. They rated their pain or aches or whatever it was on a scale from 0 to 100, where 0 was I'm not feeling anything, to 100 is this is intolerable. Well, suppose the patient had said during their baseline months, no, I don't feel any of this pain, which to make it simple. But during placebo months, they said, I'm starting to feel something. I rated a 25. Well, then when they went on a statin, and they didn't realize they'd gone from placebo to statin necessarily, suddenly it just like went through the roof. Oh, this is totally intolerable. Well, no doctor should be sitting down in front of that patient and telling them these aren't really intolerable. You've said it's a rating of 100, but we have to subtract off the 25 that you felt was on placebo. So it's not as intolerable as you think, so don't worry about it. It only seems intolerable. Does anybody think that the human mind works like that? Does anybody think that the patient shouldn't get up and walk out of the doctor's office at that point? It's just not the way that works. So to illustrate this graphically, we have baseline months, certain amount of normal aches and pains. You'll have the placebo months. Whatever the placebo exceeds the baseline is the nocebo effect. And then you have your statin months, and whatever the statin exceeds the placebo is considered to be statin induced. And I think that's where the error is. I think that we could drive a truck through this one. The statin induced adverse effects can be everything over the baseline months. So for reporting results, they compared the rated symptoms from the statin months and the placebo months against the baseline. So they use this formula here. There's a nocebo ratio, which is the placebo load, which I'll show in a moment, minus the baseline load divided by the statin load over the baseline load. And that should give you a number between 0 and 1 if the assumptions are correct. A value of 0 says there is no nocebo effect. A value of 1 says it is all nocebo effect. So let's look at that graphically. Same graph, I've just labeled it differently. So here's where the load is. The baseline load is whatever the normal feeling of aches and pains is. And the excess for placebos is however much higher the placebo is than the baseline. And the excess for statins is however much higher the statins is than the baseline. But then they're dividing these two things. They're putting the placebo into the numerator and the statin excess into the denominator and saying, okay, the placebo is all this amount and the statin is only what's above the placebo. There was a problem here, and that is the results violated expectations for many individuals. Individuals didn't have this nice, clean, oh, the placebo months are baseline or greater, the statin months are placebo or greater. They were all over the place. They had negative ratios. They had wildly high ratios, up into the 60s, for example. So what they did was they pooled the data together with these equations. In other words, it wasn't for each individual, it was for everybody all added together, and then they did the division. I'm a software engineer, and I have actually a flow chart that explains what they did. And here it is. They took garbage, they put it through the formulas and their processes, and they got garbage out. Unfortunately, the way this was treated by the press was garbage went in and they got gospel out. There are things they could have done to make it better, but as long as they have that corrupted data, those people who didn't meet their expectations, then this is garbage going in. Some of the data is probably good, but there's enough garbage in there to corrupt it. In the supplementary appendix that came with the report, they included some examples of the various patterns that they came across. There were some patients, patient 10 and 28 were given as examples, who had like ever-present symptoms, so you really couldn't do anything with their calculations because they were just constantly had aches or pains. There was the successful rechallenging. Now these are people who had a history of statin intolerance and they had very few symptoms. Kind of unusual in my mind, but maybe they were on higher doses before. Those were given as examples. And then they gave an example of the nocebo effect. Patient 45, yeah, I would admit they seem to have the nocebo effect. As a matter of fact, this is a case where the nocebo is exceeding the statin, but their original first 2 months were on statins, and then it looks like they had 3 months of no treatment, and then they got back on them. So you can see, they're playing with people's minds there. They also said patient 26 here was an example of nocebo effect. I'm not sure about that. Something was clearly going on in that 1 month where they just basically hit maximum on their adverse effects when they were on a placebo, and it did recover quickly. There may have been something going on in their life with that, because if you compare all the other months, then they actually had worse symptoms on statins with that one exception. So something was going on there. Found it interesting that they didn't give us examples of other patterns, what I call an anomalous response. It just made no sense. Their placebo months were way higher than the statin months. Case of patient 29, that's exactly what we see here. That's like there's something wrong, there's something we don't understand about this patient's response, and they really ought to get to the bottom of that on a case-by-case basis. With only 60 patients, I can see that you could actually review each case. You couldn't do it if you had thousands of patients. I understand that. And again, patient 26 I think is anomalous. I could be convinced that maybe it's not, but this is the sort of thing that we really need to pull out from the data. This is the garbage data that needs to be removed when you're making a population calculation. And then there are many examples of statin intolerant. Patient 43 is clearly statin intolerant. They hit their bad effects on their first statin month. They had 2 months of nothing where they had baseline established, which was basically no aches and pains. They had a statin month and they got onto placebo and it dropped off. Took a while to get off, so there's a lag time in there. And then the next several months they were on placebos, and then 3 of their final 4 months were on statins, and each time you can see that pink area there, they got off the statin and they just said, I'm not doing this anymore. These are coming on. This patient clearly has no nocebo effect at all and is clearly statin intolerant. Patient 24, very similar situation. They had a lot of side effects when they were on the statins, not so many when they were on placebos, though they did get off or at least stopped reporting on placebos for a while because something was going on there. And again, patient 23, another good example of that. Now, I went through the data. I found maybe 19 or 20, about a third of the patients actually exhibited something that you might consider a statin intolerant pattern. So I think that's what they should have done, is they should have identified the various different patterns here. So here's some reasons that the data could get corrupted. First, the noise can swamp the signal. Now that's techie talk that just says the normal variation, the inaccuracies in a subjective measure of aches or pains, for example, from day to day, can be larger than what they're trying to look at here. For example, it's hard at the beginning of the month to say, oh, this pain is at a 12 level, and then, by the end of the month, how do you know it's the exact same pain and you're going to give it the exact same number? I think there were naive expectations on the part of the clinical designers that there was precision in the rating system that probably just isn't there. There could be a symptom and health impact of frequent starting and stopping of statins. Now, it was all done randomly. You could be doing 4 months of statins, 4 months of nothing, and 4 months of placebo, or they could be interspersed in everything. I'll get to that in a moment. And then there could be a hyper-awareness by the participants during those treatment months where like, oh, I'm taking a pill. I don't know if it's a placebo or a statin, but I should pay attention a little more closely. Now, you could argue, well, yeah, that's part of the nocebo effect, and that's fair enough. That could be a component of the nocebo effect itself. But these are all data issues that can just cause some of these anomalies that they found in many. They said some of the patients. I looked through the charts. I think it was many of the patients. So here's some of my observations about this trial. First, the random assignment of treatment months worked against developing a clean analysis of the results. Now, this is one of the few studies where they actually did have those non-treatment months interspersed. And I think that was a good idea, the way they did it. And the randomization, I think maybe they overdid it a little bit. Maybe they would have been better off if they just took 3-month periods where each period would have a baseline, placebo month, and a statin month in some random order so that the patient wouldn't know, except for, of course, the non-treatment months. And then they would have probably been able to gather enough data, similar, common data to figure out what's going on. That may have defeated the purpose of what they were trying to do. So I understand why they're randomized. It just kind of blew up in their face a little bit. This trial highlighted the need to individualize treatment rather than relying on statistics. Those patterns that I showed, people who are clearly statin intolerant, well, it was a lot more than 10% of the population. But the point is, if you said, well, 90% of it is nocebo effect, that's not what you're experiencing. That clearly was what many of those patients were experiencing. They were experiencing real statin adverse effects. So some more useful statistics that they could have got out of the study, well, they could have told us the proportion of anomalous results. Now, you can look at the charts and kind of figure it, but they didn't give us the numbers. They just gave it the graphical charts. And graphical charts are usually better than staring at numbers, but for trying to figure some things out, you really need the numbers, and I just couldn't get those. But, how many of these results gave us a nocebo ratio that was either negative or far greater than 1? And I would say, yeah, if you get a 1.1 or a 1.2, that's probably okay. You can say there's a little bit of noise in there. That's somebody who's 100% nocebo effect. But when you get something that's up 60, 70 for a nocebo ratio, something is wrong with what's going on there and something needs to be analyzed. It would be nice if they gave us at least the nocebo ratio for the non-anomalous results. In other words, the people who kind of met those expectations. What was the mean and the median there? Because if we look at just at those, because we might guess that those are things that there wasn't a problem with gathering of the data, and I'd like to see what those values really were. So what are my conclusions from all of this? Well, first, as long as the mainstream medical profession and the media is hell-bent on pushing statins on the general public, we're only going to get biased reporting and attitudes about the nocebo effect. I mean, they tried taking the high road in this report saying, yeah, the effects are real. They are real, but they're a nocebo effect. And if you tell the patient that, that's going to solve the problem. Now, when I get into the philosophy of statin intolerance, you'll see that there's a much better approach. Secondly, every statin study should have a statin-hesitant professional involved with the trial design, execution, and analysis in order to bring these issues to the forefront right at the beginning in the design and at the end in the reporting of the results. So here's some medicine for thought. Suppose you want to know, am I suffering from the nocebo effect? Well, let's ask what patient populations are not susceptible to the nocebo effect. And if you're in any of these groups, it's possible or likely that you are not suffering from the nocebo effect. First, if you have a clinically measurable objective adverse effect, rhabdomyolysis. You can't nocebo your way into rhabdomyolysis or necrotizing myositis. It just doesn't happen. You're not going to nocebo your way into elevated liver enzymes. Second, patients who develop symptoms after a long period of treatment. They weren't even covered in this. And I think that's most of the adverse effects. It was years before I started to feel the adverse effects. They were probably slowly accumulating and then they broke through to my conscious level. And at that time, I was in group number 2 here. And I was also in group number 3, which is patients who initially do not associate symptoms with the statins. I had no clue what was going on with me. It took me 3 years to realize that it was the statins that were likely causing it, and another year for me to convince myself that was really the case, because I didn't know anything about how they can affect your brain and stuff like that. These are things that are not being covered by this study. And then finally, patients who are generally unaware of the adverse effect controversies. In other words, if they don't know that, oh, we want to be asking you about muscle pain. Well, if you're asking me about muscle pain in this study, then I know that's an adverse effect. But if you're just giving a statin and you're never told a possible adverse effect of this is muscle pain, which is just one, myalgia, if you don't know that, the nocebo effect shouldn't make that up for you. That was actually the one I knew about, and that was the one that ultimately I did finally feel, but I was having a whole bunch of other effects that my doctor kept on telling me, no, statins don't cause that, even though you read the literature, which I finally did. Shame on me for being naive and trusting to the doctor, but when I finally did read it, yeah, I found out, yeah, they do cause these things that were happening to me. Unfortunately, nobody watching this video can claim to be in category 4 anymore because you've watched this video and that took you out of category 4. But if you have any of these other sorts of characteristics to your statin experience, it's not the nocebo effect. So that's my take on the Samson trial. I think there was some valid data in there, and I think that the result was overinterpreted. So if you appreciate this content, please like, share, subscribe, and comment. And I ask people to comment, share the story if you feel comfortable doing so, and it's not exposing any personal information about yourself. And the reason for that is it helps other people. Shared experience. Other people may look at it and say, oh yeah, I'm not alone. That's really what happened to me too. So I think that's very therapeutic for all of us if we can share these stories. So if you haven't seen this video, I recommend that you watch it now. Thanks for listening.